The door of the Graves ranch house closed with the sound of a coffin lid sealing. It was a solid, final sound that echoed the closing of a life. Ilara stood on the porch, the December wind tearing at the thin wool of her shawl, a baby bundled in each arm. Behind that heavy oak door was everything she had once been promised: warmth, security, a future. Now, it was just a wall of wood between her and the past. Her husband Thomas was 2 days in the cold ground, taken by a fever that had burned through him like a prairie fire. His father, Mr. Graves, a man carved from the same hard granite as the surrounding mountains, had wasted no time. He had summoned her to his study, the air thick with the smell of leather and bitter disappointment. He had never approved of his son's choice, a schoolteacher's daughter with hands made for books, not for the brutal work of a cattle empire. He pushed a small, worn leather pouch across the polished desk. The clink of coins was insultingly light. $20, he said, his voice flat and hard. For the boy's memory. He did not say his son's name. He also pushed forward a folded piece of paper, the deed to the old North Ridge ice house. The property is worthless, Graves stated, not as an apology, but as a final judgment. But it is titled. No one can say I left my son's widow with nothing. He had said it in front of the ranch foreman, making it a public declaration. He was fulfilling the letter of his obligation while gutting its spirit. The injustice of it was a physical thing, a cold knot in Ilara's stomach that was worse than the wind. Her Thomas, a gentle soul who had loved poetry and botany, had been a constant source of shame for his father. Now, his wife and children, Leo and Lena, were the final loose ends to be tidied away. She was being erased. She walked away from the ranch and toward the town of Prosperity Gulch, a single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings that seemed to lean on each other for support against the relentless wind. The twins were a heavy, precious weight in her arms. Every eye in town seemed to be on her. They had seen her walk up to the Graves ranch a widow. They saw her walk away an exile. Pity was a suffocating blanket, thick with whispers and knowing glances. Mr. Gable, the owner of the town's mercantile, stopped her on the boardwalk. He was a man whose opinions were as neatly stacked as the tins on his shelves. "Ilara," he began, his tone oozing a condescending sympathy. "A tragedy. A true tragedy. There's a stagecoach east in the morning. Best use that money to get back to your own people. There's nothing for you here." His words were meant as kindness, but they were just another door closing. Go away. Disappear. Be someone else's problem. Ilara looked at his face, clean-shaven and certain, and then down at the 2 small, sleeping faces nestled in her arms. Her people were here, breathing the cold air in her arms. Her world was no longer a map of towns and territories. It was the 6 feet of space she occupied, and the 2 small lives that depended on it. She held his gaze. "I'll need a shovel," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "and a good cast-iron pot, some nails, salt, and flour." Gable stared, his mouth slightly agape. This was not the response he expected. He saw the foolish pride of a woman who didn't know when she was beaten. "On what money?" he asked, his tone hardening. Ilara walked past him and into the store. She placed the leather pouch on the counter. The coins spilled out, a meager constellation of silver and copper. She also laid down a heavy, well-oiled axe. It had been Thomas's, a gift from a grandfather who had believed a man needed at least one useful tool, even if he preferred books. It was all she had left of him that was practical. "On this money," she said, "and I'll trade the axe for the goat if I must." She bought what she could, a shovel with a sturdy handle, a heavy black pot that would last a lifetime, a small sack of flour, another of salt, a handful of precious, costly nails. She had just enough left for a small bag of beans and a flint and steel. The purchases were a declaration of war against the fate everyone had assigned her. She was not leaving. She was digging in. As she walked out of town, leading a pregnant nanny goat she'd managed to trade for with a sympathetic farmer, the whispers followed her like stray dogs. She didn't look back. The path she took led north, away from the town, climbing into the wind-scoured hills where the timber grew thin and the rock showed through the soil like bone. She was walking toward the worthless place. She was walking toward home. The journey was a pilgrimage of pain. The wind was a physical force, a bully that shoved and screamed, trying to push her back toward the town she had rejected. She had fashioned a sling for one of the twins, Lena, who slept fitfully against her chest. Leo was cradled in her left arm. Her right hand held the rope for the goat, which bleated miserably, pulling against her with every step. The shovel and pot were tied to a crude harness on the goat's back, along with her meager supplies. Every muscle in her body screamed. Her arms ached with a deep, burning fire. Her back felt as if it might snap. The cold was a living thing, seeping through her clothes, numbing her fingers and toes. The landscape was brutal and unforgiving, a palette of grays and browns under a sky the color of slate. The sun was a weak, distant memory. She walked for hours, her world shrinking to the next step, and the next, and the next. She finally saw it as the light began to fail. It was not a house. It was a wound in the hillside, a gaping black rectangle of shadow cut into the earth, framed by massive, roughly hewn granite blocks. Part of the sod roof had collapsed inward, leaving a jagged hole open to the sky. A pile of rubble and frozen earth blocked half the entrance. It smelled of decay, of dampness so old it felt like a permanent feature of the stone. This was the ice house. Built by the town's founders decades ago to store blocks of ice cut from the river, it had been abandoned for years. It was a forgotten place, a tomb. Ilara stood before it, the wind whipping her hair across her face, and for the first time a wave of true despair washed over her. It was so cold it felt hot, a searing wave of hopelessness that made her knees weak. Gable was right. Graves was right. The whole town was right. This was not a place to live. This was a place to die. She looked at the dark opening, then down at the sleeping infants in her arms. Their innocent, trusting faces were a silent accusation. She had brought them here, to this. The tears that came to her eyes froze on her cheeks, sharp and stinging like needles. A gust of wind, stronger than the rest, hit her like a physical blow, nearly knocking her from her feet. It carried with it a flurry of ice crystals that scoured her skin. Instinct drove her forward, into the shelter of the entrance, out of the direct assault of the wind. She stumbled past the rubble pile and into the deep shadow of the interior. And then she felt it. Silence. The screaming of the wind was gone, replaced by a profound, echoing quiet. The air was still. But more than that, it was different. It was cold, yes, but it was a dead, motionless cold, not the biting, life-stealing cold of the wind outside. The fury of the world had stopped at the stone threshold. She took a few more steps into the darkness, her boots crunching on the frozen dirt floor. The goat huddled behind her, trembling. As her eyes adjusted, she could see the immense scale of the place. The walls were thick stone, 4 feet thick at least, disappearing into the blackness of the hillside. The ceiling, where it was intact, was a heavy structure of massive timbers and a thick layer of sod and earth. She ran a bare hand along the stone wall. It was cold, but it was the steady, neutral cold of deep earth, not the frigid cold of the surface. As she moved deeper inside, away from the broken entrance, she felt another change. The air was warmer here. Not warm, but measurably, undeniably less cold. She pressed her cheek against the stone wall at the very back. It felt almost temperate. Then she heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound. Drip, drip, drip. She followed the sound to the back corner. There, a tiny, glistening thread of water trickled down the rock face from a fissure, collecting in a small, clear pool on the floor before disappearing into the earth. It was a spring. A living spring, running in the heart of winter, protected from the frost by the tons of earth and rock above it. Despair did not vanish in a triumphant wave. It receded, slowly, like a tide going out, leaving behind a grim and rocky shore of possibility. The thick walls, the earthen roof. This was not a house. It was a fortress of thermal mass. The earth itself was her insulation, a shield against the wind and the killing cold. The spring was life. Mr. Graves had given her a tomb, thinking it an insult, but he had unknowingly given her the one thing that might save them. He had given her a cave. The first task was to close the wound. The collapsed section of the roof and the open front were an invitation to the cold. Sleep was impossible until she could block the wind. She laid the twins, wrapped in every blanket she had, in the deepest, most protected corner near the spring. She tethered the goat nearby. Then she turned to the pile of rubble. Work was her only prayer. She attacked the frozen earth and stone with the shovel. The shock of each blow traveled up the handle and into her bones. Her hands, soft from a life of teaching and books, were raw within the hour. Blisters formed, broke and bled, the salt of her own sweat stinging the open wounds. She didn't stop. She used the larger, flatter stones from the rubble to begin building a crude wall across the front of the structure, leaving only a narrow opening for a door. She worked by the failing light of the gray day, and then into the deep, profound blackness of the moonless night. She worked by feel, her hands learning the shape and weight of each stone. Her muscles screamed, then went numb, then screamed again. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak she wore, but beneath it, a cold, hard fire of resolve was burning. Every stone she lifted was a defiance. Every rock she set in place was a word in an argument with the world. I am still here. We are still here. By dawn, a crude wall, 4 feet high, stood across the entrance. It was ugly, unstable, and full of gaps, but it broke the direct assault of the wind. She collapsed next to her children, her body a single, throbbing ache. She did not sleep. She drifted in a state of numb awareness, listening to the breathing of her babies and the muffled howl of the wind outside her new stone wall. The next days were a blur of relentless labor. The wall had to be higher, stronger. She needed mortar. She remembered seeing clay deposits near rivers. She took the shovel and found a thick, gray vein of it near the spring's outlet behind the ice house. She mixed it with water and sand to create a thick, sticky daub. She chinked the gaps in her wall, plastering the clay into every crack with her bare, bleeding hands. It froze almost as soon as she applied it, but it held, sealing the wall against the wind. Next was the roof. The hole yawned above them, a constant reminder of their vulnerability. She used Thomas's axe to fell small, dead pines from a grove down the hill. She had never chopped down a tree in her life. The first one took her half a day. The axe was clumsy in her hands, the blows glancing off the wood. But she learned. She learned the rhythm, the bite of the steel, the satisfying crack as the tree finally gave way. Hauling the logs up the hill was a fresh torment. She dragged them one by one, her heels digging into the frozen ground, her lungs burning with the effort. She laid them across the hole in the roof, then wove a lattice of smaller branches between them. Finally, she used the shovel to heap sod and earth on top, packing it down until the patch was as thick as the rest of the roof. With the shelter sealed, the next priority was fire. Without it, the deep, passive cold of the earth would eventually claim them. A fire in an enclosed space was a death sentence without a chimney. She searched the stone ceiling, her eyes tracing the lines and cracks in the rock. She found it near the back wall, a narrow fissure that seemed to go straight up. A puff of her breath near the opening was drawn faintly upward. For 2 days she worked to widen it. She used the sharp end of the shovel and a heavy rock as a hammer, chipping away at the stone. It was painstaking, agonizing work. Shards of rock fell, cutting her face and hands. But slowly, painstakingly, the hole widened. She built a hearth on the floor beneath it, a semicircle of flat stones, and walled it with more clay-mortared rock. She gathered dry wood from the underside of fallen logs, hoarding it like treasure. She shaved a small pile of tinder. With trembling hands, she struck the flint against the steel. A spark flew. Nothing. Again. Nothing. Her desperation grew with each failed attempt. The babies were crying, a thin, hungry sound that tore at her resolve. Finally, a spark caught the tinder. A tiny orange ember glowed. She blew on it, gently, carefully, feeding it tiny twigs. A small flame flickered to life. She fed the flame, then the small fire, then the growing blaze. Smoke, thick and white, billowed into the chamber. Then, miraculously, it found the hole in the ceiling and began to draw upward. It worked. A column of smoke was rising into the sky. Warmth began to push back the profound cold. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She sank to the floor, the light of the flames dancing on her face, and wept. The fire transformed the space. It was no longer a tomb, it was a hearth. The stone walls, cold for decades, began to absorb the heat. The immense thermal mass of the structure became her ally. The fire warmed the stone, and the stone held the warmth, radiating it back into the room long after the flames died down to embers. The temperature inside stabilized, holding at a cool but survivable temperature even with a low fire. She established a routine dictated by the needs of the fire, the goat, and the children. She built a small pen for the goat in a corner, its body heat adding to the warmth of the room. She channeled the spring water into a small cistern she dug and lined with clay, providing a constant source of clean water without ever leaving the shelter. She learned to set snares, catching the occasional rabbit to add to their meager diet of beans and goat's milk. 1 month after her exile, she made a final trip to Prosperity Gulch. She needed more supplies if they were to last the winter. She left the babies sleeping, warm and safe by the fire, a new heavy door made of rough-hewn planks barricading the entrance. The walk to town was different now. Her body was harder, her hands calloused. The cold was still an enemy, but it was a familiar one. Her appearance in Gable's Mercantile caused a silence. She was thinner, her face weathered, but her eyes were clear and direct. She looked like a creature of the wilderness, not the soft-handed schoolteacher's daughter they remembered. She bought 2 laying hens and a sack of feed with the last of her money. "You can't keep chickens in that hole," Gable said, unable to stop himself. "They'll freeze solid in a week." "The cold stays out," Alara said simply. The town had a name for her now. They called her the Cave Girl, or, more cruelly, whispered about Grave's Folly. They saw her leading her new chickens and goat back into the hills and shook their heads. They told the story of the proud widow who had chosen a frozen tomb over civilized charity. It was a good story, a cautionary tale to be told around warm fires. Back in the ice house, she built a small coop for the hens near the goat pen. The first egg, small and perfect and warm in her palm, felt like a jewel. It was another small victory, another proof of life in a place meant for death. The deep winter settled in. The world outside her stone walls became an abstraction, a howling whiteness she only glimpsed when she ventured out for firewood. Her life was governed by rhythms. The rhythm of the fire, which could never be allowed to die. The rhythm of milking the goat. The rhythm of her children's sleep. The rhythm of her own aching body. The isolation was absolute. Some days, the only voice she heard was her own, humming a lullaby to the twins. The goat and the chickens were her silent companions. Their simple, living warmth was a comfort in the vast, cold silence. The world had shrunk to the space contained within these stone walls. It was a small kingdom, but she was its sovereign. She was not just surviving. She was presiding over a functioning, life-sustaining system she had built with her own 2 hands. A small pack of wolves, drawn by the scent of the goat, circled the ice house one night. She heard their paws on the frozen earth of the roof, their howls echoing in the chimney. She held Thomas's axe and stood by the door all night, her heart pounding, but the stone walls held. The heavy door did not splinter. They could not get in. In the morning, they were gone. Her fortress had been tested, and it had held. In late January, the sky turned a strange, bruised purple. The wind died down to an unnerving stillness. The air grew so cold it hurt to breathe. Elara felt a primal sense of dread. She brought in a massive stockpile of firewood, stacking it against one wall until it reached the ceiling. She checked the chinking on her door and walls, sealing every last crack. She prepared. Then the storm came. It did not arrive like a normal blizzard, with rising winds and gentle flakes. It fell out of the sky like a hammer, a sudden, violent explosion of wind and snow that blotted out the world in an instant. The wind didn't howl, it screamed, a high, thin shriek that sounded like tearing metal. Inside the ice house, the sound was a dull, distant roar. The stone walls vibrated with the force of the gale, but they did not yield. The fire in the hearth burned steadily, its smoke drawn cleanly up the fissure chimney. The animals were restless, but safe. The twins slept in their small wooden cradle, oblivious. Elara sat by the fire, listening to the death of the world outside, and felt a strange, profound calm. Her systems were working. She was outside the storm's reach. For 3 days, the white hurricane raged. In Prosperity Gulch, it was a catastrophe. The town was built of wood for milder seasons. The wind tore shingles from roofs and shattered windows. Snow, driven with the force of sand, forced its way through every crack, every keyhole. It piled in drifts that buried doors and windows, trapping people inside their own homes. The cold was the true killer. It was a deep, invasive cold, far below zero, that no amount of firewood could fight in a drafty wooden house. Roofs, laden with impossibly heavy snow, began to groan and splinter. The steeple of the church cracked. Mr. Graves's grand ranch house, the symbol of power in the valley, had its great glass windows blown in, and the storm poured into its elegant rooms like an invading army. The town's confidence, its very structure, was breaking apart. On the 4th day, the wind lessened slightly, though the snow still fell thick and heavy. Elara was rationing her wood, keeping the fire just high enough to maintain the life-sustaining warmth of the stones. It was in the deep twilight of that afternoon that she heard it, a sound that was not the wind, a frantic, desperate pounding on her door. She grabbed the axe, her heart leaping into her throat. Wolves didn't knock. She moved to the door and listened. A voice, hoarse and broken, cried out, muffled by the wood and the storm. "Please! Is anyone there? Help us!" She unbarred the heavy door and pulled it inward. A figure, completely encased in snow and ice, stumbled and fell across her threshold. It was a man, his face a mask of frozen desperation. As she dragged him toward the fire, the snow fell away from his face. It was Mr. Gable, the mercantile owner. He was barely coherent, his words tumbling out between chattering teeth. His wife, Martha, was sick, a lung fever. Their house was freezing. The chimney was blocked, the roof groaning, their firewood buried and gone. He had seen a wisp of smoke, a ghost in the blizzard, and had stumbled toward it as his last hope. He had walked for hours, lost and freezing, following the impossible sign of life. Ilara looked at him, the man who had told her to run, who had pitied and dismissed her. She saw the memory of his smug, certain face on the boardwalk. She thought of her own carefully counted logs of firewood. Every piece she gave away was a piece she took from her own children. The calculation was cold and brutal. But then she looked at the raw terror in his eyes, the plea of a husband and father. She looked at her own children, sleeping peacefully in the warm cradle. He was asking for what she had fought so hard to create, a chance at life. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an obligation. "Bring her here," Ilara said. Her voice was steady. Gable shook his head. "She cannot walk. The child, our son, he is freezing." Ilara did not hesitate. She moved with the fluid efficiency of her winter routine. She banked the fire. She bundled the twins in warm goat hides and secured them in their cradle. She put on her own heaviest wraps. She found a small, crude sled she had built for hauling firewood. She loaded it with precious logs, with blankets, with a sealed jug of warm goat's milk. She handed Gable the rope. "Show me the way." Plunging into the storm was like diving into an ocean of ice. The wind tore the breath from her lungs. The snow was a blinding, suffocating wall. They could not see more than 3 feet in front of them. Gable, exhausted and disoriented, was almost useless. But Ilara had a map of this land burned into her memory. She knew the slope of the hills, the feel of the ground beneath her feet. She navigated by instinct, a creature of this harsh world. The journey to the town was a battle for every step. The sled overturned twice, and they had to scrabble in the deep snow to retrieve the precious firewood. When they finally reached Gable's house, it was a scene of utter despair. The inside was barely warmer than the outside. Ice coated the interior walls. Martha Gable was huddled under a pile of frozen blankets, her breathing a shallow, rattling gasp. Their young son sat beside her, blue-lipped and shivering uncontrollably. Working together, they cleared the chimney and started a fire with Ilara's wood. The frozen house drank the heat greedily. Ilara wrapped the boy in a warm blanket and forced him to drink the goat's milk. She helped Gable move his wife closer to the growing fire. She showed him how to seal the windows with rags and snow to block the drafts. She worked with a quiet, grim competence that left him speechless. She was not the foolish girl he remembered. She was a force of nature. When the immediate crisis was over, she left them with half the firewood. "Keep the fire hot," she said. "I will come back." She fought her way back to the ice house alone, following the faint trail they had made. When she finally stumbled back inside her own shelter, the warmth embraced her like a living thing. Her children were still sleeping. The fire was still glowing. Her small kingdom was safe. The next morning, Gable returned. He was not alone. Behind him were 3 other men from the town, their faces grim. "There are others," Gable said, his voice full of a shame that was deeper than the cold. "The Brants, their roof collapsed. The widow Jensen, her fire is out. My God, Ilara, we were so certain. We were so wrong." They stood in the entrance of her shelter, their eyes wide with disbelief. They stared at the scene before them, The steady fire, the dry, warm air, the healthy animals in their clean pen, the neat stack of firewood, the cistern of clear water, the green shoots of some herbs she was growing in a small box of earth near the fire. And in the center of it all, two healthy, pink-cheeked babies sleeping soundly. They were looking at a miracle, an organized, functioning world hidden in the heart of the storm that had destroyed theirs. They had come expecting to find a half-frozen madwoman in a hovel. They found a sanctuary. It was Gable who finally broke the silence, his voice cracking. "We called you the Cave Girl. We called this place a folly. We were the fools." Elara looked at their shocked, humbled faces. There was no triumph in her, no satisfaction. Vengeance was a luxury she had never been able to afford. Her victory was not over them. It was over the cold, over death. That was the only victory that mattered. "There is stew," she said, her voice calm and even. She gestured to the large iron pot simmering over the fire. "Eat. Then take what wood you can carry. Bring the children here. They will be warm." Her quiet grace was more devastating than any accusation. It stripped them of their pride and left them with nothing but the raw, humbling truth of their failure and her success. They ate her food, their hands trembling, and did not meet her eyes. Over the next 2 days, the ice house became a refugee camp. Elara's small shelter housed 4 families, the children huddled together near the fire, their parents working to ferry supplies and help others in the town. Her home, the place of her exile, had become the heart of the community's survival. She directed the men, telling them which houses were most vulnerable, how to reinforce a roof, where to find the driest wood. They listened without question. Her authority was absolute, earned not by wealth or name, but by competence and character. Even Mr. Graves eventually appeared. His grand house was ruined, his cattle herd decimated. He stood at the entrance of the ice house, a powerful man made small by the storm. He looked at the scene inside. He saw the townsfolk he commanded now taking orders from the woman he had cast out. He saw his grandchildren, Leo and Lena, awake now, gurgling happily in Elara's arms. He saw in them the son he had lost, and the future he had thrown away. He said nothing. He simply turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. When the storm finally broke and the sun returned, it shone on a changed world. Prosperity Gulch was shattered, but it was not broken. The work of rebuilding began, but it was done differently. The community no longer saw the hills as something to be conquered, but as something to work with. People came to Elara's home, not for rescue, but for knowledge. They asked how she built her walls, how her chimney worked, how she had stayed warm. She shared her knowledge freely. The derisive nickname was forgotten, as if it had never existed. They called her settlement the Hearth now, or sometimes Elara's Hold. It was no longer a symbol of folly, but of resilience. In the spring, when the town was rebuilt, the new houses looked different. They were built lower to the ground, with thick stone foundations dug into the hillsides. People learned the value of thermal mass, of insulation, of working with the landscape instead of against it. The lessons of the ice house were written into the new architecture of the town. Elara never moved back to Prosperity Gulch. The Hearth was her home. It expanded. The community helped her build a small, proper house connected to the front of the ice house, which remained the warm, stone heart of the homestead. Her small farm grew. Her children grew, strong and healthy, playing in the mountain sun. Years later, travelers passing through would hear the story of the Great Blizzard of '83 and how the town was saved by a woman who had been left to die. They would be shown the clever houses built into the hills and told they were built in the style of the Hold. Elara became a quiet legend, a woman defined not by what was taken from her, but by what she built from the nothing she had left. She sat on her porch one summer evening, watching Leo and Lena chase fireflies in the twilight. The air was warm, scented with pine and damp earth. She looked at the solid stone entrance to her home, the place that had been her refuge and her crucible. She had been given a worthless hole in the ground, a place of endings. And with her own 2 hands, fueled by a mother's fierce and desperate love, she had turned it into a beginning. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a world.